Hi, my name is Doug Sagano, and I'm just another volunteer at the Cannon Beach Library. I'd like to welcome to our second in our 22-23 Northwest Author Series. Our reader today is Cal Angus from Portland, and I'd like to do a little thank you to Schooners Cove for putting up Cal and his partner this weekend. Cal Angus is a trans writer and editor living in Portland, Oregon. He's the author of the story collection, A Natural History of Transition. He has been a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award in transgender fiction, the Edmund White Award for debut fiction, and an Oregon Book Award, Ken Kesey Award in fiction. A former bookseller at Powell's, something that I'm jealous of. He holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a BA in geography from Mount Holyoke College. He has taught writing at Smith College, UMass Amherst, and Clark College in Vancouver, Washington. Cal has worked as a fishmonger, a barista, a reporter, and an advocate with the Trans Youth Equality Foundation, where he helped transgender youth and their families navigate the world. Please join me in welcoming Cal Angus.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everyone showing up today. It's just fun. I haven't read in a library before, so this was a very special occasion for me. My book came out during COVID, so most of my readings have been on Zoom. And it's nice to include them as well today. So, but also welcome to everybody in person too. So I'm happy to be here. And I thought I would read a little bit from my collection, A Natural History of Transition. This is a collection of short stories that span several centuries of history, as well as different locations. So it's primarily drawing from East Coast locations, which is where I grew up. I grew up in upstate New York and New England before moving out here about 5 years ago with my husband, who's back there in the corner. And he drove me out here today, so thank you. So yeah, we'll have time for some questions. I'm open to talking about all different aspects of writing, of craft, of teaching, bookselling, publishing. I've worked in lots of different literary jobs over the years. And these days I'm lucky enough to be able to just be focusing on the writing for a little while. But I thought I would start with a short story, a shorter piece that's called Moon Snail. From this collection. And this has an epigraph that's from Gertrude Stein, who is an inspiration, but also she used to work as a marine biologist before she was a poet, if you knew that, in Connecticut, actually, in Woods Hole Marine Biological Lab. This was back in like 1893-ish, so pretty long time ago, and right before she became overtaken by poetry. She was a scientist. And that's where a lot of my work sits, is in between poetry and science, as I think you'll probably see. This is based on that, but it's not necessarily a true to life story. So Moon Snail. Science is continuously busy with the complete description of something, with ultimately the complete description of anything, with ultimately the complete description of everything. Gertrude Stein. Getting out of the boat was transome. She perched and swung there, balanced on a wave while her classmates watched which way the hinge would swing. Up in the air, light as a turn, or down to the sea. A fracturing of light and cold and wet, held close to the skin by petticoats, a breaking of camaraderie as the men tried not to laugh, tried to hoist her from the shallow divot in the rocks where she sometime might have liked to stay among the anemone, mussels, and crabs, filled and emptied twice a day at the moon's insistence, like her hopes for what she'd see in the viewfinder, Microscopic streamers, embryos smothered under glass, or just a lot of cloudy nothing, which only looked like nothing until a twist of knob crystallized all the unnamed swimmery spinners that occupy a vacant space. Inside the lab is where things unbend and show off. At first, she thought she knew the story of birth. Now she realizes how much more there is than blood and cry and doubling. There's the whole before and after. Before the bee leaps into being, the quiet, energetic egg. Translucent limbs in flux, fluttering ghosts of gestures they'll perform on land. In this place where they are at the start of taking the start so seriously, she hadn't expected to be telling a new story each day about life and death, sense and understanding. She wanted to slow down and think more about keratin, limestone, calcium, break it all down piece by piece like a moon snail drilling a hole in the shell of a smaller snail and flooding it with caustic juices before slurping it all out. She would like to do that to the world around her, liquefy until it bleeds together. She walks the path of the Nautilus, exploring its shell through winding streets to the boarding house, always stopping off at the beach. She marvels at the shell, the 3x3x3 of it, the perfectly stacked whorls one on top of the other like china plates on a sideboard. She wants to be inside of its geometry, part of its perfect equation. She can't get inside the embryo sandwiched between strips of glass, but maybe if she thinks hard enough, she can shrink her thoughts to fit, concentrate them like little cubes of bouillon, condensed so more potent. She would keep them that way all the time, to have something sharp about her, even when she leaves the shell, something to resist digestion. Morning, creak of boarders, women all around her, most waiting for beloveds out at sea or visiting their scientist fiancés. Lying in bed, she waits till they've all left. She does not enjoy small talk about husband's grand discoveries, which are nothing more than routine experiments made gigantic by man talk. Men magnified everything. Certain women ate it up. She rises, puts up her hair and dresses, smiles to find a breakfast warm and wrapped for her by the landlady, whom she rarely seesaw, but they understood one another. Salt did that to a woman, she thinks. It's doing it to me. She looked forward to being slowly desiccated by the sea. Take me down to Salt Cod, she thinks. Make me a thin crust of mineral on the rocks, tenacious, bitter, but necessary for life. She found herself using the lab's way of looking on other things. Light, silverware, the drape of a dress, fallen down barns. A poet makes science out of everything the scientist ignores. She tried opening her viewfinder wider, found she could, make a study of the folds of fabric in a skirt, the slatted fences, the slots left open, the kettle's curves. She grasped the space between the words of fisherman's speech, the rocking boats. How frightening the amount she could miss. Once in a while, she'd be waiting her turn at the nets or on the beach alone, and everything would stick, slow down to freezing, and then come unglued. So easy to separate things from what made them separate, from what made separate thingness desirable. All could be strung along the necklace of thingness, an abacus of those and thises. These were not thoughts she shared then. She wrote reports, dry language about what fit inside the microscope's dark circle, and it was a relief to set it all down in distinctly labeled sections, to ignore the voice inside that said, "But you forgot the flickering of the oil lamps when you stayed late. You forgot eyes burning. You forgot." Did her feelings not influence the development of the cold beating heart on glass? Were they insulated from her caring? Wasn't it listening to the phonograph like she was? Would it quicken when her heart quickened? Day after day, pipetting their little bodies onto slides, keeping them moist to remember, she felt responsible for them, slotting them back in their wooden boxes like cribs, describing every part of them like Kim, the ones she liked. The man at dinner spoke casually of moving rivers, of dikes and channeling, the flood and rush of it. He laughed when she said she'd like to try to move one too, said she'd be better off with her fish eggs, let men of industry worry about which way the rivers go. But she would see many such rivers, forking this way and pooling that, falling where the dynamite blasted, drying up where men drained them, running turbid with the surge of men until she found a final bank on which to rest that hadn't moved since she'd said stay. But for now, the water haunted her. It all seemed to belong to men. Men on the shore, in the boats fishing off the banks, men waiting for the catch on docks, covering the loosened boards with spit. She despised and admired them, wanted to be one of them or among them, free of her separateness, wanted to liquefy them too. One day, she and the other women who spent their time looking through microscopes and writing down what they saw, all in a boat together. She didn't know them well, knew the men better, but then it was nice for a few minutes just to sit among them, remarking to the quiet oarsman on the shape of the waves and the cormorant's stance, and not have it met with boasts of swimming unmanageable distances. He smiled, rowed, agreed with a sharp intake of air. They spoke of the landing site, a pocket beach remote and wheeling with seabirds, where they would spend the afternoon collecting specimens, putting thin white wrists into bone ache water, pulling out slime and cold junk of life. She felt a bit whole for a sliver of time. They came round the point to where they could see the men grinning, each with a boutonniere in his lapel. There were blankets, one for each woman, roses and vases sunk in sand, champagne uncorked and cooling in a tide pool. The men carried them through the shallows so they would not wet their skirts. Gertrude waved them off, got wet, got salty, got to the shore and was chagrined at how eager the women in the boat were for chivalry on a deserted island. Nets lay abandoned to the side, all collection forfeit to restore this shameful order. If she hadn't thought of herself much before as Gertrude, but more as she, now she knew she wasn't she but Gertrude, something made separate not by the peculiarities of herself, but by the other's separateness from her, their strange habits. She was more like the lonesome embryo than them, the sharp stab of sunlight through the shallows to slaty gray pebbles than them. And the pity was that the roses were pretty, but she couldn't enjoy them because she was more like the moon snail than them. So that's moon snail. So I wanted to start with that story because we're at the ocean, a different ocean than this one takes place in, but similar cold junk of life and all that. Tide pools. I have tide pooled out here. That's the one thing I have done out at Cannon Beach before, and that is a joy. And also, I think there's a kind of poetry and spareness of language that comes with living so close to the ocean that I enjoy writers who also write in that way. And that seems like a good place to start for today. I will say that that's quite different from a lot of my other work. And one of the things that I enjoy most is playing with different styles, taking on, not trying to imitate Gertrude Stein per se, but trying to honor her with the kind of language and the digestion of language that she is so well known for. And yeah, we're going to do questions at the end, but if you ever have a question or want to talk about something that you've heard, just feel free to pipe up too. I'm fairly informal. Um, but the next story that I'm going to read is called Rock Jenny. And this is a very different kind of story, though with some shared natural history impulses that you'll probably pick up on. This story, some of you may be happy to hear, has dialogue in it, has characters, as does much of my work. But yeah, I think I'll just jump into Jenny. This one's longer than Moonsnail, so I'll probably take more water breaks too. Thank you, by the way. Rock Jenny. Jenny's first change, like everybody else's, was expected. After the requisite meetings with the school's gender counselor and milk crates of journals full with her weighing the pros and cons of boy or girl, she called Jack and Queenie into the kitchen on the eve of her 11th birthday. Her parents sat tense and watched their only child announced to them, betraying no sign of the fast-pumping heart inside, that he had decided he would like to be a boy. In a tearful hug, the trio came together, not out of relief, for Jack and Queenie would have been happy and supportive had their only child decided to be a girl instead, but because they were caught up in the fluttery pathos that accompanies the first of many such moments for a family. Queenie called her sisters, and Jenny's phone was soon flooded by OMG, boys together, and whoa, I would have thought, all of which she ignored by powering down its battery and crawling onto the roof outside of her bedroom window, where the night was just beginning and she could watch the full moon rise over the ridge of mountains like a broken saucer, thin crater lines like spider cracks where it had been glued back together, whole. Jenny might have predicted a second change. Nonetheless, she tried to avoid it until there was no other option. Jenny played basketball with the other boys. Jack showed Jenny how to change the oil and gave her her first car. Jack kept a specialty garage that worked on small engines and did good business because the other white men in their small New England town trusted him easily. Queenie was a geologist, the first Black woman hired by the university to study rocks, and one of her favorite things to say when she came home fuming was, "We can choose our gender, but let a Black woman near a seismograph and they lose their shit." When everyone started pairing off to go to junior prom, Jenny had her mom call the mother of her date and explain that she had come down with strep throat and would be unable to attend. Queenie hung up and said to no one in particular, "Why bother becoming a boy at all if you're going to treat a young woman like that?" It was her mother's comment that started Jenny thinking that maybe she was wasting her time trying to fit into the decision she'd made. High school passed in a blur, and finally she was living on her own, growing her hair, going weeks without coming home, getting braids and manicures, and avoiding Queenie's text messages. When Jack finally did stop by one day, Jenny was on her way to work, and their cars nearly collided in the driveway. Jack got out to apologize to a person he assumed to be Jenny's girlfriend or roommate for almost causing a fender bender. Jenny watched Jack approach in the rearview mirror. He got as far as, "My apologies, miss," before locking eyes with her. Neither said anything. Jack got back in his car and drove away. Jenny hyperventilated, then cried, then blew her nose and drove to work. It wasn't unheard of for people to change their minds after the big announcement. 11 was very young to make a lifelong decision. Many in the medical community had long and unsuccessfully petitioned to raise the age of gender declaration for just this reason. Too many variables, Too many families ripped apart when the choice many parents assumed to be forever crumbles and they're thrust into years of therapy. All of this is what Queenie said to Jack when he reported back to her that afternoon. She hadn't consciously been expecting this kind of revision, but once Jack told her the news that their son was now their daughter, she felt she'd come to the end of a long wait. She called Jenny right away and left a voicemail to the effect of, "We still love you. We will always love you. Why don't you come over for dinner and we'll work this out?" Jenny did, in fact, leave work 10 minutes early to make it back to Jack and Queenie's on time for 6 o'clock dinner that night. But somewhere between the pot roast and the apple pie, more effort than Queenie had put into a single meal since she'd gone up for tenure, Jenny realized she felt just as trapped as she had that night before turning 11 when she had climbed out onto the roof. Her parents had downsized to a ranch, and there was no more second story to escape to this time. Zeph met Jenny at the bar. They bonded early over the fact that Zeph too had changed his initial declaration of gender. He was a white boy, or had become one, and the first white boy she'd ever dated. When she introduced Zeph to her parents, Jenny made sure they had lunch at a cafe with a patio that bordered the street, where she could glimpse the sky if she leaned out from under the awning. She wasn't ready to be inside her parents' home with Zeph and no means of escape. After lunch, everyone hugged and went separate ways. Queenie to her office, Jack to his garage, and Zeph and Jenny along the few blocks back to their apartment where they had recently moved in together. "Queenie's happy I'm with a man," said Jenny, brooding. "She doesn't know you're trans too." "Should we tell her?" "The appearance of straightness," Jenny said. Her laugh was sharp, barbed. She shrugged. "I don't know. I like the calm for now." When they reached the apartment, Jenny handed Zeph her keys and bounced in place. "You're not coming in?" he asked. She shook her head. "I'm too antsy. I think I'll just go for a quick jog." "You're wearing sandals." They both looked down at her strappy shoes that came halfway up her calves. She crouched to undo the tiny silver buckles and handed the tangle of straps to Zeph, who took them like a fragile gift. It had been a long time since he had held women's shoes, and they intrigued him. "I won't be more than half an hour," she said. Jenny ran to where their cul-de-sac ended in front of the woods, which at that time of day were dark and deep, unpenetrated by the sun. At home, Zeph sat on the edge of the bed and held the sandals, feeling their soft faux leather and intricate stitching. Jenny stepped over the curb and climbed a deer path, walking in her bare feet over roots and rocks, feeling against her face the wet slap of leaves that held on to yesterday's rain. In front of the mirror, Zeph perched on the edge of the bed and laced the straps around his ankles, every third wrap pinching his leg hair. Pausing where the trees began to thin and bare rock gave the impression of a summit with a view of the ridgeline snaking off to the left in the afternoon haze, Jenny felt a deep thrumming through the center of her chest, down to her toes, her own heart a boulder erratically thumping. A woodpecker startled her with its beat. Zeph stood in the bedroom, turning left and right, getting a look at his legs sheathed in the delicate straps. When she came home, Zeph said nothing about the twigs caught in Jenny's braids or the scratches on her arms left by the pricker bushes, and Jenny didn't bring up the red lines crisscrossing Zeph's legs. They fucked that night like two cockroaches getting ready for the end of the world inside a black bowl spinning faster than the speed of sound. What Zeph didn't say to Jenny after they finished was that he sometimes longed for more options too, and yet he was afraid of losing the Jenny he knew to new changes. The way she had changed seemed to fit into the way he had changed, and the distance between them felt safe and metric, a fixed unit of measurement he could depend on when traveling unfamiliar territory. But he remained quiet and followed Jenny through the house, turning off the lights, leaving one incandescent bulb aglow in the hall. Later, when Jenny went to the bathroom, she turned off the light before coming back to bed. Zeph knew she'd flipped the switch out of habit, and had he asked her to leave it on, she would have apologized and turned it back on, but he didn't want to say he was afraid. Zeph didn't notice the third change until Jenny came home from one of her sojourns a little bit taller. Zeph was at the stove, and Jenny, smelling of pine sap, wrapped her arms around Zeph from behind. Together they stirred eggplant, one of Jenny's own from the garden, purple-black like the cosmos. Jenny had always been taller than Zeph, but in front of the stove, he thought that perhaps her arms seemed a bit higher on his chest than usual. Her forearms were almost a shelf for his chin to rest on, when normally they landed where his binder stopped just above his belly button. He didn't think much of it then. He leaned back and enjoyed her solidity. But soon Zeph took over mowing the lawn because Jenny could no longer fit in the yellow bucket seat. She snapped plastic patio chairs like potato chips. Zeph didn't bring it up until one day when he called down from upstairs for a hammer so he could finish the plywood extension for their bed. She didn't even need to come halfway up. Standing on the ground floor, Jenny easily handed the hammer to Zeph, her head and shoulders stooped against the ceiling. Zeph asked casually if she'd noticed anything different, and then Jenny sat down on the floor, shaking the foundation. "I don't know what's happening to me," she sobbed. Zeph rushed downstairs to comfort her, stopping on the landing so he would be level with her eyes, which were by now the size of volleyballs. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with you," said Zeph, stroking her hair. They went over everything they could think of as a possible variable. Vitamins, new clothes, old clothes, purses, allergies, Mercury retrograde, fumes, chemical reactions, hormones. But nothing had changed. The skies were clear, planets misaligned as usual, even decreasing and Jenny had been on the same dose of estrogen for years, even decreasing slightly over time after she had most of the changes she wanted. The only thing different was Jenny. When Jenny reached the size of the courthouse, she became very slow. She moved like you would expect a giantess to move in a world where everything is very far away and tiny. Carefully, every gesture performed at the speed of a grocery conveyor belt. She napped on the lawn because she could no longer fit through the door. As her naps became longer, small colonies of lichen grew on her back, her thighs, showing up on a zephyr and taking Jenny over until she was covered in scales of blue and gray, like a stone from the old rock walls that ran across the property. One day, Zeph was sitting outside, getting some sun next to Jenny, when he felt a stirring in the ground. Jenny was standing up. Sheets of lichen hung from her legs, and clods of dirt and worms rained down as she stretched to her fully impossible height, or what looked impossible now that Zeph had grown used to seeing her nestled in child's pose among the rhododendrons. Her head was far above the chimney, making it difficult to hear what she was saying, even though Zeph could see her lips moving around the cave of her mouth. Zeph waved his arms until Jenny understood and began the process of kneeling. She brought her head down close to the ground. Zeph could almost fit entirely inside her ear. "What are we going to do?" Zeph asked her. I don't know, she whispered. She shed a tear that watered the garden for a month. We'll figure something out, said Zeph, leaning into her hair. A praying mantis clung to one braid and he flicked it away. We always have before. It feels different now, she said. It takes everything in me not to be a rock. Then you can't fight it, Zeph said. Just be a rock. I'll still love you. But I don't know if I'll be able to love you back. I don't know if I can still have a family as a rock. I'll deal. We all will. We love you and you'll still feel that. Jenny wiped her eyes. I hope so. Tell Queenie that I love her. Jack, too. Jenny stood up and strode off. Zeph watched to see where she would stop. About half a mile away, where the highway cut through a deposit of limestone, and then he started walking, taking a brief detour to the dollar store. He was relieved, both that he wasn't waiting for the change to happen anymore, and that it had taken place in rock, not water, something that was at least immovable by most standards. By the time he found her later that afternoon, she was motionless, curled up against the exposed cliff, soaking up the sun with a hint of a smile. With his dollar store spray paint, Zeph began marking out Jenny on the part of her hip he could reach from the ground. She gave no indication that she felt the aerosol tickling her hardened skin. Jack and Queenie nodded and looked grim as Zeph told them what had happened. Jack retreated to his garage. Queenie wanted to see where her daughter had petrified, so Zeph took her to the cut. He makes a fine rock, said Queenie, shielding her eyes against the sun while gazing up at Jenny. She does, said Zeph. Igneous or metamorphic? Sorry? I'm just wondering what type of rock my daughter is. Metamorphic is buried and subjected to intense heat and weight. Igneous is made by explosive force, pushing molten rock into hidden places or out the Earth's crust. I'm wondering what sort of pressure she was under. Zeph and Queenie looked at Jenny closely. Great boulders, small pebbles, even imprinted fossils were all mishmashed into the bulk of her. Sedimentary, said Queenie, putting one hand on her daughter's thigh, the size of a house and rough to the touch, layering over time until she became a mix of something else, just like she wanted. Over time, sedimentary layers get compressed and twisted. Great upheavals scramble acres of desire and frustration and loneliness until they become so mixed up even the most expert geologists abandon the possibility of untangling dates and seismic events. Rocks like Jenny have great waves inside them, like the ocean, only slower. On the outside, baby maples sprang up on Jenny's thighs, and the nape of her neck was fast overgrown with poison ivy, sun-loving spreader, though she couldn't feel the itch, only the tickle of its roots in her own. And then there were the rains, which seemed to come more frequently these days and in more intense bursts. She didn't mind the rivulets and tiny streams that coursed through her depressions. They could be exfoliating in a way. Only there were so many and they'd taken so much of her away. In places, they had stripped her down to bedrock, where erosion was slower but more painful, deepening the scars in her topsoil, exposing fossilized memories of mammals and more peculiar hurts she'd long unthought. Deeper still, she carried on thinking in rhythms indecipherable to passers-by. She could feel their every footfall, while her dreams registered to them as only minor rockfalls. Jenny's faults and fissures flipped over and over again, a great geological churning that defied the stately pace of change in stone. Were she a volcano, she'd have been called active. But no larger than a small moraine, the grain of her indecision went unnoticed to the outside world beyond a yellow diamond sign planted by her right hip, warning of the hazards of walking by without a hard hat on. Years passed before the fourth change. Rock Jenny's had become an established local landmark. Zeph ran the front desk and sent buckets of rock through the polisher. Bits and pieces of tourmaline and jasper dug by Queenie from Jenny's pores to sell in the gift shop. On weekends at 10 and 2, Queenie led informative hikes, starting at the small building attached to Jenny's left ankle and winding along the ridge, where she pointed out the rock formations of her spine. Jack towed an old rail car to the cut and opened a diner next door. Soon, Rock Jenny's grew a reliable crop of old-timers who depended on the black coffee and Canadian bacon to keep them going through the work week. And every fall and spring, the students would come in loudly at midnight to sober up with waffles. Jack served them all, while Queenie and Zeph slept in the back. When the first tremors began, Queenie rushed to the roof of the diner to investigate. She almost fell over from shock when Jenny picked her head up, blinking her lids like tectonic plates. I would love some coffee. Jack dumped pot after pot into the rain barrel while Jenny stretched out, making sure her limbs weren't blocking any roadways. She rested her head on her forearms. Zeph joined Queenie on the roof. Zeph, Mom, it's nice to see you two getting along so well. I've missed you, honey, said Queenie, glancing at Zeph. We all have. I'm sorry I've missed so much, said Jenny. Each time she nodded her head, it blocked out the sun. She looked sad. I know you might think I've made some selfish choices, but I hope someday you can understand that I'm just seeking my truth like all of you. Mine's just been a little bit harder to find. Zeph shook his head. We've managed pretty well, considering, he said, gesturing at the diner, the gift shop, the dirt-packed life the three of them had built together. Yes, this place is adorable, Jenny said, looking around. She slurped Jack's coffee through a PVC pipe. That's why I'm afraid to tell you this, she continued. But I think I've made a mistake. What do you mean a mistake? Said Queenie. Well, Jenny looked up at the sky. I thought I wanted to be a mountain, but why not the moon? But we're established now, you can't go. Jenny looked sad again, and angry too. I know, and I don't begrudge you that. You made do with what you had, a mountain, which, when viewed in just the right light, looked like a girl. That's a good angle, and you worked it. So did I. But we were only making do. It feels like my whole life I've just been making do. But I'll miss you, sweetie. We'll all miss you. I'll keep in touch, Mom. Jenny rumbled. She shook so hard that great chunks of her dislodged and hit the ground like meteors. She crouched low and then sprang up into the air and continued rising until she disappeared in the sky. She left behind a crater the size of several Olympic swimming pools. Shortly after, Queenie erected a contraption that allowed her to filter from the air infinitesimally small particles of sand, which she said were tiny pieces of Jenny born on the wind. The sand got caught in a large web of gossamer and collected in a small glass beaker. Sometimes Queenie would pick up the tiny beach of Jenny and give it a shake. She could hear an echo of her laughter that way. Every couple of months, they talked about what to do with the crater. Turn it into a pool or a lake with a beach, sell the natural gas rights and profit. But ultimately, they let it sit as a testament to their loss and to Jenny's many transformations against all expectations of gravity. Jenny's crater changed on its own in a succession of tiny grasses, weeds, clumps of purple vetch, daisies, and cattails that loved the damp bottom. The maples grew taller, oaks took root, and it grew into a deep, impenetrable forest, through which a stream, burbled, coursed, ran, and otherwise generally moistened the surrounding plants and animal throats. Jenny's crater outlived her family and the structures they had thrown together, its uneven topography furthering a slow but steady erosion of the soil. Thank you. Thank you. So that's what I'd planned to read for today. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, either in real life or via the internet, I'm happy to answer them or just hang out and chat for a little bit. Thank you so much for spending this beautiful afternoon, unseasonably warm afternoon with me here. It's been very lovely. So, any questions? Yeah.
What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on a novel. Not the first novel I've written, but maybe the first one that will be published one day. And it's still pretty early in the process, but I could say two things about it. That one is that it has me doing a lot of research into the Lewis and Clark Centennial in 1905 that took place in Portland. And it also, in large part, is narrated by a lichen that has evolved to feed on human greed. So that's what I can say about it so far. Thank you for asking.
No,
Yeah.
Do you want to reveal any tidbits about the art centennial?
Listen,
I mean, any random tidbits?
well, as you can probably tell, I tend to run with the facts a bit, and so I'm not quite sure how I'm going to use the material yet, though part of it will be set there. And I'm interested in, we live in North Portland now, fairly close to where the Centennial was held, but there's no trace of it anymore. And there are many neighborhoods and spots in Portland that have been built up and then wiped clean, from the land. And so I'm interested in that. I'm interested also in that moment at the turn of that century, when categories and organizations of, or I should say hierarchies of people and animals and places were starting to be cemented into the sort of popular imagination and the popular racial imagination of the West. So when you look at the maps of the Centennial, you'll see it all kind of laid out, how there's these specific pathways people are supposed to take through the story of humanity and time. And I'm interested in what that does to a person, walking through these representations of categories that we're supposed to belong to. So, yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
When you were writing about Jenny,
Yeah.
so how far ahead did you see?
That's a good question.
For the transitions or metamorphosis?
I had seen to her the beginning of her third one, Into the Mountain. And that was also, well, let me back up. When I write, I don't often have an ending or a plot in mind. I am the kind of writer who, it's not really worth it to me to tell a story that I already know the ending to when I start writing. The exciting part to me is finding out what's going to happen and learning just as much as the characters do. Some writers like to barrel ahead toward an ending, and they know how to get there, and that's exciting for them. And I've tried that, but it's not. It usually goes very poorly. It's just not as interesting. So I knew that I wanted her to go beyond the second change, because I'm interested in giving trans characters more than one transformation and letting them change over and over again instead of remaining as one thing. as a trans person myself, that's kind of my experience of life is, yes, I transitioned when I was about 20, but I've had many more changes, and in by many strokes more interesting changes than that one since then. But as I was telling Jenny's story, I knew that her moving from one gender to another wasn't going to be enough for her, and that I knew I wanted geology to play a role in it too, because I think there's something fun and destabilizing when you start moving rocks around and changing them, and because they're also supposed to be very. I studied a little geology in college, but I continue to study it now just on my own and learn from it and from people who write about it. But rocks too, we think of them as really set in place. They're not going to move. They're not going to change. But when you take a step back, they do change quite a bit, right? And especially Oregon's geology is really exciting and fun to study too. And I've been getting a lot of inspiration from that. I wrote this, I guess, did I write Rock Jenny before I moved to Oregon or after?
Right.
Yeah, maybe I did write it after, actually. I couldn't remember. But I get a lot of inspiration from Oregon's geology, especially. Like right now, I'm also working on a story about that also involves craters and volcanoes in the desert of Oregon. So I can't quite get away from them. But I think when I wrote Jenny's third transformation as a mountain, I put it away for a little while, and it didn't feel finished to me yet. And when I came back, then I started listening a little more to her and writing more into her thoughts as a mountain, which was actually something my editor had asked me to do. Like, what's she thinking in there? When she's this mountain, what's she thinking about? And that helped me get to her final, or what I suppose it's her final transformation, or at least the ending. Yeah, we don't know. Maybe she could be doing whatever out there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Did you think about along the way about the ethics of
Ooh.
because I really felt that, and I think in terms of aging and having a partner that you're aging with, even it's really interesting to think of all the different ways that you love a person differently as through over time.
Totally.
And that when we start out, we don't know who we're going to grow into being.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. People don't often talk about the love story, the relationship in this story. And more often the focus has been on, when I read it, is on her family and how they respond. But yeah, the relationship between Zeph and Jenny is important, I think, to how she changes, to how their changes sort of echo off of each other, right? And over the years and how that works. I think that there's other stories that I've written where I focus more on that relationship between two people and over the years, and as my own relationship has continued over the last decade or so, it's something I'm more interested in writing into. Like with the lichen, which many of these rocks or plants or animals, I have realized I'm thinking with them over a long period of time. Like, I tend not to just leave them behind in a story. I'm like, okay, we saw what happened there. Well, what happens if I keep thinking about the lichen more and more? And that's a symbiosis, right, between algae and fungi that live together, provide resources that the other can't give the other one. And I find that to be a really interesting metaphor for a marriage too, or for a relationship too, is that, and what scientists are realizing now about lichen is that it's not just a partnership, it's actually a community. There's yeasts in there, there's bacteria in there, which also, is what most relationships are too, is a community of people. So yeah, definitely. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Was the beginning of Rock Jenny in describing her first transition and her relationship with her family, is that in part inspired by your work as a counselor?
Ooh, Probably. I wouldn't say that I worked. I would say I worked more on the like camp counselor side of counselor rather than like therapy side of counselor. Um, back then, but yeah, I did work a lot with young preteens deciding to transition, and this would have been about 2011, 2012, in Maine. And that was such a hard time, I think, for any young person, but also to be kind of changing who you are in school, in family, navigating all of these politics that are all of a sudden thrust into your life, that I definitely did want to imagine what would it be like if this was expected, right? Because the first change that Jenny undergoes is that sort of declaration of gender, which happens very quickly in the beginning, so it's easy to forget by the time you get to the end of the story. But it is a world in which their young people are expected to decide what gender they want rather than being assigned it at birth. So yeah, I think so. I would say it is. But then, more change can still happen after that, right? Even in a world where that's expected. Yeah.
We have a question from the audience online.
Mhm.
And Nancy wants to know, how much rewriting did you have to do in the book that you?
Oh, and the whole book?
Yeah.
Rewriting.
How much rewriting did I do, or I guess revision of any kind? It always feels like more. By the time I started working with editors on this, I was definitely feeling like they're good to go. All the stories are done. Like, hooray! But then, so that was a process of a bit more rewriting than I think I was expecting to do. But none of the stories really changed in shape by the time they were in the book. Things stayed pretty much the way that they were. And I would say it took me about 3 years to write all the stories that were in here. And because when I write, I tend to edit as I go along. I don't go rush through a draft and then stop and revisit it. There's never really a moment when I'm like, this is the first draft of this story. Instead, things are sort of always changing, and I'm going back and moving things around. So it's a little bit more fluid than that, I would say. Thank you. Yeah.
Had any of those stories been published elsewhere?
Yeah. I think there's 8 stories in here, and 4 of them had been published online in online literary journals. And then 4 were original. My publisher said, stop stop publishing them. We want to keep them for this. But yeah, and I continue to publish in online literary journals. I run an online literary journal too. It's called Smoke and Mold, and we publish nature writing broadly defined by trans and two-spirit writers, which is a subject dear to my, yes, Smoke and Mold. 2 things we're very familiar with these days. Yeah. And did you have a question?
Well, I don't know what is going to come out of my mouth, but I just think that, my impression is that your writing is so poetic, and you also have a very melodious voice. So when you're reading, that's a poetic experience as well. But the question about rewriting, it seems to me that you must choose every word so carefully because your vocabulary is amazing, and the choice of words helps us really see in different ways when it's a more complex word. So I'm not sure whether that's a question, but then when somebody is saying, how much rewriting, that seems really painful because you put all this thought into each word.
Yeah. Well, thank you. First of all, that's very sweet. And sometimes some of the editing is going back and choosing the right word. I would say probably the bulk of my editing is going in and switching out words, not doing the sort of thesaurus type thing, but just making sure that it's the word that I really want to be putting in there. And also, there's a writer named, his name is Tony Tulatumuti, and he's a novelist. He lives in New York City, but he's a writing teacher as well, and he's very passionate about never using longer words or more words than you need to get your point across. And while I'm not like 100% devoted to that approach, I do find it useful in short, like condensing my sentences to the least amount of words that they need to get the point across. And yet I have a real love of like language and scientific words, especially. So finding that balance between not sounding too wordy or too like scientific or academic, but also preserving some of the wonder of language in my work is something that is important to me. And there was something else you said that I was thinking of. The reading aloud, which it took me a while to settle into like the voice of how to read this book, in part because my voice has changed so much over the last 10 years, but also some writers and readers will read and vary their pitch a lot and make different voices and that sort of thing. And I always felt my voice was very monotone when I was reading. And but my lovely husband, what did I ask you? I asked you, I was like, what do you think of my reading voice? And you thought the monotone was really cool. And so I've just tried to lean into that a little bit more. And that's really helped actually to lean into the thing that I thought was kind of boring about my voice. But if everyone read in wild voices, then that would be boring. So work with what you've got, kind of thing. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's, unless there's any more questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I wanted to remind the audience that we'll be back November 12th with writer Ellie Alexander. Thank you for tuning in.